The morning sun cast a golden hue over the quiet streets of Millbrook, a small town tucked away in rural Georgia. Neighbors greeted each other with familiar waves, the hum of lawnmowers and the chirping of birds painting the town in its usual picture of southern serenity. But for James and Margaret Carter, that morning was anything but ordinary. Margaret stood at the front porch, arms crossed, her eyes squinting toward the road at the end of their gravel driveway. She had done her hair and picked her favorite lavender blouse for the occasion. Beside her, James leaned against the wooden railing, weathered hands tucked into the pockets of his faded jeans. His face was as unreadable as ever, his military posture betraying only the slightest hint of tension. Their daughter Emily had called the week before. "He's coming to visit," she had said, her voice bubbling with nervous excitement. "I really want you to meet him." And so the Carters prepared, not for a casual meet and greet, but for an unspoken evaluation. They had expectations, standards, maybe even prejudices, though neither would admit it aloud. "I bet he drives a Tesla or something," Margaret murmured. "Emily said he works in the city. Probably has one of those fancy tech jobs." James grunted. "We'll see." At exactly 10:03 a.m., a cloud of dust stirred at the far end of the driveway. Margaret squinted harder. A vehicle approached, slowly. But instead of a shiny car, it was an old pickup truck, sun-faded red, one headlight dim, and the engine letting out a stubborn cough as it rolled closer. Margaret's expression dropped. "Is that?" The truck came to a halt near the porch. The driver's door opened with a creak, and out stepped a tall man with tousled brown hair, wearing a plain navy t-shirt, jeans, and boots scuffed with years of use. He took off his cap, revealing a friendly, open face with a smile that didn't quite mask his nervousness. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he called out, walking toward them with cautious steps. "I'm Ethan, Emilie's boyfriend." For a moment, no one spoke. Margaret blinked. "James's brow furrowed. You're Ethan?" James asked, voice low and skeptical. "Yes, sir." James's gaze flicked to the truck, then back to the man in front of him. "You sure you're at the right house?" Ethan chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I hope so, sir. Émilie sans meilleure adresse. She told me to be here at 10. Margaret stepped forward, trying to recover her poise. "Well, come on in." Ethan followed them inside, the wooden screen door slamming lightly behind him. The house smelled of lemon polish and fresh biscuits. Photos of Emily adorned the walls, childhood portraits, high school graduation, her first day teaching. James sat at the head of the dining table, arms crossed. Margaret took her seat across from him. Ethan was motioned to sit at the far end. Emily, who had been waiting anxiously in the kitchen, emerged with a tray of lemonade and tried to smooth over the silence. "Hey, you made it," she said, planting a kiss on Ethan's cheek before sitting beside him. "Everything okay?" Ethan nodded. "Smooth drive. Your town is beautiful." James cleared his throat. "So, Ethan, what is it that you do in Atlanta?" "I work in operations at a restaurant group," Ethan replied, choosing his words carefully. "Mostly logistics and support." "Restaurant business, ou?" James's tone was neutral. "You a cook or something?" "No, sir. More behind-the-scenes work, scheduling, training, vendor coordination." "I like it." "Good money in that?" Ethan smiled modestly. "Enough to live comfortably. I try to save as much as I can." Margaret sipped her lemonade. "Do you rent or own?" "Currently renting. I'm hoping to buy in the next couple of years." James leaned forward, elbows on the table. "And what makes you think you're ready to settle down? You've only known Emily what, less than a year?" "Almost a year, sir," Ethan said, keeping his voice even. "But I've never been more certain of anything. Emilie's changed my life. I care about her deeply." Emily reached under the table and gave his hand a quick, reassuring squeeze. Margaret noticed, but said nothing. Lunch was served shortly after, a traditional southern spread of fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, and cornbread. Ethan complimented every dish, but the atmosphere remained stiff. James continued the interrogation. "So your folks, what do they do?" "My dad passed away when I was in college," Ethan answered. "Mom's a retired school librarian. She lives in North Carolina now." Margaret finally spoke again. So you're self-made? In a way, Ethan said with a small smile. I've been working since I was 15. Paid my way through college, did a lot of odd jobs. I've always believed in earning my keep. There was a pause. Emily looked between her parents and Ethan, silently pleading for them to soften. But James had one more question. And votre coup de cid? That yours? Ethan nodded. James raised an eyebrow. You planning to drive that thing for the rest of your life? Ethan smiled again, unshaken. I could afford a new car. But this one reminds me of where I started. It's not flashy, but it runs. And it keeps me grounded. Silence again. The rest of lunch passed with more eating than talking. When it was over, Ethan helped Emily clear the table while James and Margaret retreated to the living room. That could have gone better, Emily whispered as they loaded dishes into the sink. I expected worse, Ethan replied. At least your dad didn't kick me out. Emily laughed softly, but her eyes betrayed concern. They're just old-fashioned. They want me to be with someone stable. Secure. And I'm not. You are. But they don't see it. Not yet. Ethan dried his hands and turned to face her. Then let them. I'm not going anywhere. We'll get through this, together. She nodded, leaning into him. I love you, Ethan. I love you too, Em. Enough to play the long game. Outside, the summer breeze rustled the trees, the town moved on with its ordinary rhythm. But inside the Carter home, something unfamiliar had been set into motion, something quiet, subtle but powerful. Attestat Beguin. And Ethan Walker was ready to see it through. That evening, the sun dipped low over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the Carter household. The once warm day cooled into a still and heavy dusk. Inside, the clatter of dishes and the scent of meatloaf filled the kitchen, while the quiet tension of earlier lingered like humidity that refused to lift. Ethan had spent the afternoon helping James fix a broken fence post behind the garage. There wasn't much conversation, only the sounds of hammering, the occasional grunt of exertion, and a few clipped instructions from James. Ethan followed each one carefully, responding with polite yes, sir, and got it. Still, the silence between them was not yet comfortable. Margaret, meanwhile, had stayed in the kitchen, preparing dinner with Emily. But every now and then, she would glance out the window, watching the two men work. Her brow furrowed with thought. As dusk settled in, they all gathered again around the same dining table, now neatly set with plates, napkins, and glasses of iced tea. The ceiling fan overhead hummed gently, moving the air just enough to chase away the stickiness of the southern summer evening. Margaret set down à haute dish. Dîner est ready. Let's sit. Everyone took their place, James at the head, Margaret beside him, Emily next to Ethan. For a few moments, there was only the sound of cutlery and glass clinking, the creak of wooden chairs. This meatloaf is great, Mrs. Carter, Ethan offered, hoping to soften the atmosphere. Margaret gave a tight smile. It's an old family recipe. James chewed slowly, then glanced at Ethan. So, Ethan, you say you work in restaurant operations? Yes, sir. You manage one place? No, I work across several locations. We're a group that operates a few different concepts around Atlanta. James raised an eyebrow. You mean like a chain restaurant? Not quite. We focus on upscale casual dining, locally sourced, chef-driven menus. Margaret's fork paused in mid-air. Do you ever think about doing something more stable? I mean, restaurants can be risky, can't they? Ethan didn't flinch. They can be. But I've been in the industry for years, and I've built up experience and strong relationships. I find a lot of purpose in what I do. James took a sip of tea. And you're renting now? Yes, sir. Y a va place in Midorn. It's small, but close to work. I'm saving for a down payment. Margaret gave a soft hum, and returned to her plate. Ethan pressed on, his voice calm. I know it may not seem like much on paper, but I've worked hard for everything I have. I've been independent since I was a teenager. It's not flashy, but I'm proud of the life I've built. James looked up from his plate. You retires-tu? Just turned 31 last month. James set down his fork. At 31, I already had a mortgage and a baby girl in my arms. Emily stiffened. Dad, times are different now. They're only different if you make excuses for them, James replied, not raising his voice but firm. I'm not trying to be hard, but I want to know what kind of man thinks he's ready to take care of my daughter.
Ethan Maysize.
A man who knows that real responsibility isn't about how much you own, it's about showing up, every day, no matter what. Silence followed. Emily held her breath. Margaret glanced from her husband to Ethan, her expression unreadable. James finally leaned back in his chair.
You veux go to answer for everything, don't you?
I've had to, Ethan said quietly. When you grow up without much, you learn to explain your worth without showing it off. Emily reached for his hand beneath the table, gripping it tightly. He gave her a small, reassuring squeeze. Margaret changed the subject. So, Ethan, what are your parents like? Ethan turned to her. My dad passed when I was 20. He worked construction.
Hard man, good man.
My mom's a retired librarian. She lives in Asheville now. Margaret nodded slowly. Does she know about Emily? She does, Ethan replied. And she's very excited. She wanted to be here, actually, but she's recovering from a recent surgery. Margaret's tone softened. I hope she's doing okay. She's tough, Ethan said. She raised me on her own after Dad passed. Most of who I am comes from her. James didn't say anything, but the mention of a single mother struck a note. A flicker of understanding passed across his features, but it faded quickly. After dinner, as Emily and Margaret cleared the table, James stood up and motioned for Ethan to follow him outside. The two men walked onto the porch. The cicadas had begun their nightly chorus, and the sky was painted in streaks of lavender and orange. James lit a cigarette, something he only did when he was deep in thought. He looked out into the darkening yard, then turned to Ethan.
You love my doctor.
Ethan nodded. With everything I've got. You plan to marry her?
Ida.
James studied him. You know, I've seen a lot of men come and go from this house. None of them lasted long. You're the first one she ever brought home. Ethan waited, unsure where the conversation was going. James continued, I'm not gonna lie. I don't like not knowing what a man stands for.
You come here, no fancy car, no big talk. You could be a lead.
You didn't. I don't respect your resume yet, but I'm watching. Ethan nodded. That's fair. James pointed at him. But hear me, son. If you hurt her, if you let her down, I will hold you accountable.
You understand.
Ethan met his gaze, unwavering. Yes, sir. And I wouldn't expect anything less. James took one last drag from his cigarette, then crushed it under his boot. Without another word, he turned and walked back inside, leaving Ethan standing alone on the porch. Emily joined him a few minutes later, her eyes questioning. He say anything terrible? She asked. Ethan smiled, then shook his head. No. But I think the real conversation's just beginning. Emily leaned into him.
You're doing better than you think.
But inside, Ethan knew it wouldn't be that simple. The next few days would test him more than ever. It wasn't just James or Margaret anymore. It was the town, the neighbors, the ghosts of expectations. And maybe, someone from Emily's past. He wasn't just being tested. He was being measured. Quietly. Relentlessly. And he had no choice but to endure. The next morning in Millbrook began like any other. The smell of bacon drifted from kitchen windows, dogs barked in distant yards, and the sun filtered through tall pines standing guard around the Carter home. Ethan was already awake, helping Margaret in the kitchen by slicing fruit while Emily prepped coffee. James sat at the table reading the local paper, his glasses perched low on his nose. The quiet was suddenly interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Margaret peered through the window, then turned quickly, a slight smile curling on her lips. Well, look who's here. James looked up, his expression unreadable. Outside, a sleek black Ford Mustang rolled into the driveway, its engine humming with self-assurance. The car gleamed in the morning light, spotless and assertive, completely at odds with Ethan's dented red pickup. The driver stepped out and adjusted his designer sunglasses. Tall, well-dressed, confident, Brandon Hill. Son of a local construction magnate, Brandon had been Emily's would-be suitor for years. Their parents knew each other well. He had the wealth, the polish, and the pedigree James and Margaret had once envisioned for their daughter. Emily stiffened beside the coffee pot. "I didn't know he was coming," she said quietly. Ethan glanced at her, noting the tension in her shoulders. He didn't speak, didn't need to.
A knock at the door.
Margaret was already there, opening it with a welcoming tone reserved for old friends and unspoken dreams. "Brandon."
What a surprise, sweetheart.
"Morning, Mrs. Carter," Brandon grinned, stepping inside with the confidence of someone who never needed an invitation. "I was in the area, thought I'd say hello."
Heure d'Emilie Somme.
James stood and extended a hand. "Brandon." Brandon shook it with a firm grip. "Good to see you, sir. Looking sharp as always." His eyes scanned the room, then landed on Ethan. For a split second, something unreadable flickered in his gaze. He turned to Emily. "Hey, Em." "Hi, Brandon," she replied, polite but reserved. Margaret, meanwhile, was already pulling out another chair.
Comme joint US for breakfast.
"We've got plenty." Brandon hesitated just long enough to glance at Ethan, then smiled. "Don't mind if I do." The six of them now sat crowded around the table. Ethan felt like a guest in his own chair. Brandon took up space easily, talking about his recent trip to Miami, a new lake house his father was building, and how the family's construction business had just won a major contract with the state. "Dad's letting me oversee the project," Brandon said between bites of toast. "You know, starting to take on more responsibility." James nodded, impressed. "That's a big deal." "Yeah, it's been a challenge, but I've always liked a good challenge," Brandon replied, his voice smooth. Margaret beamed. "You've always been so driven."
Ethan sipped his coffee in silence, watching the conversation ping around the table like a tennis match.
Emily sat beside him, offering the occasional smile or nod, but her eyes never really left her plate. Eventually, Brandon turned toward Ethan, still smiling. "And you're Ethan, right?" Ethan nodded. "That's right. What do you do in Atlanta?" "I work in restaurant operations." "Oh, cool. Like managing shifts and that sort of thing?" "Something like that," Ethan said evenly. "More behind-the-scenes logistics and planning." Brandon leaned back, clearly unconvinced. "Must be tough work." "I have a few friends who tried to make it in the restaurant business. Most of them burned out in a year." "It has its moments," Ethan replied, calm. "But I've been doing it long enough to know what I'm doing." James cleared his throat. Brandon's been helping his father expand their business. They're looking at properties all over the state. "Sounds like you're on your way up," Ethan said, not unkindly. "I try," Brandon said, his tone light. "Of course, having a good foundation helps. Can't build much without land and tools, right?" Ethan didn't flinch. The comment was subtle but intentional. Margaret didn't react either, but Emily's fork froze mid-air. She quickly dropped it and stood up. "I think we could all use some fresh air. Brandon, would you like to see the garden?" Brandon looked surprised, but nodded. "Sure." As they left the table, Margaret turned to Ethan. "He's always been such a gentleman." Ethan didn't reply. James was watching him again, but this time, there was a hint of something deeper in his expression. Curiosity, perhaps. Or comparison. Outside, in the backyard, Emily led Brandon past the rows of tomatoes and basil. "You didn't say you were coming," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "Didn't think I needed to," Brandon replied. "Your mom's always happy to see me." Emily gave him a side glance. "You knew Ethan would be here." Brandon shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not."
Look, Em, I'm not here to steer anything.
"I just think you deserve more than whatever this is." She stopped walking. "You don't know anything about him." "I know he's not from around here. I know he doesn't have a name people recognize. And I know you, Emily."
You've always wanted something real.
Emily crossed her arms. "And you think money makes something real?" "No," Brandon said, stepping closer. "But security does. Reputation. Stability. You think someone like him can give you that?"
Emilie's eyes narrowed.
"I think someone like him already has, More than you ever could. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she turned and walked back toward the house. Inside, Ethan stood up as she entered, instinctively sensing her unease. She didn't say anything, just took his hand and led him out to the front porch. They sat side by side on the wooden steps, the air buzzing with cicadas and tension. "He came here on purpose," Emily finally said.
To challenge you.
"To challenge me." "I know," Ethan replied. "And it's not the last time someone will." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm sorry." "You don't need to be," he said softly. "You didn't bring him here. But I'm glad he came." "Why?" "Because now I know exactly what I'm up against." She looked up at him.
Are you afraid?
"No," he said, lacing his fingers through hers. "But I'm aware. This isn't just about winning your parents' trust anymore. This is about proving to this town, to your past, to anyone watching, that love isn't measured by a last name or a paycheck." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, letting those words settle. Ethan added, "We've got work to do, Em. But I'm all in. Every step."
A wind swept through the trees, shaking the leaf-like whisper. Somewhere in the distance, church bell rang.
Time was moving, quietly but surely. And Ethan Walker, sitting on the edge of this quiet town, knew the test had only just begun.
The day faded slowly into twilight, bathing the Carter household in a warm, golden glow.
After dinner, Brandon had finally left, offering Margaret one last handshake and flashing a confident smile toward Emily. When the door closed behind him, silence followed, heavy and unmoving. Emily retreated to her room early, clearly exhausted by the day's tension. Margaret made tea in the kitchen while James sat on the porch, staring out into the dimming sky. Ethan lingered in the guest room at the back of the house, where he had been staying since his arrival. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small open duffel bag on the floor. It wasn't packed, not yet. But the idea had been circling his mind since the afternoon. Brandon's arrival wasn't unexpected. What surprised Ethan more was how quickly he was welcomed, how effortlessly he was absorbed into the family dynamic, as though he'd always belonged. And maybe, in a way, he had. Born and raised in Millbrook, Brandon carried a name people respected, even if he hadn't earned much of it himself. Ethan thought of James's reactions at the table, of Margaret's glowing tone. He thought of Brandon's smirks, his passive digs, and the subtle way everyone seemed to lean toward him without realizing it. It wasn't that Ethan was angry. No, he was tired. Tired of defending his worth without ever getting the chance to show it. He rose from the bed and walked to the small window. Outside, the backyard was cloaked in shadows, the faint flicker of porch lights barely cutting through the dusk. Fireflies blinked lazily near the grass. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that usually calmed him. Tonight, it only deepened his unrest. A creak on the wooden floor made him turn. Emily stood in the doorway, wearing a faded t-shirt and pajama pants, her hair pulled back. "You weren't going to say goodbye?" she asked. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He sat down, running a hand over his face. "I haven't packed," he finally said. "But you were thinking about it." He looked up at her. "You saw how they looked at him. How they look at me." Emily walked in, closing the door softly behind her. She sat beside him, her hand brushing his. "You think this is the first time my parents have made me feel like I'm not in charge of my own life?" Ethan didn't reply. "They mean well, but they've always had this picture in their heads. A safe picture. Brandon fits in that frame. You don't." He turned to her. "That's the problem, Em. I don't want to fit into someone else's frame. I want to build something new, with you. But how can I do that when I feel like I'm being tested every minute I'm here?" She looked at him, her eyes softer now. "You think I don't feel it too? Every word my mom says, every silence from my dad, it's exhausting. But you're not alone in this." Ethan stared at the floor. "I'm not trying to win a contest." "I know," she said gently. "But you are standing on a battlefield."
And I'm standing with you.
The room was quiet again, except for the faint hum of crickets outside the window. Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you want to leave?" she asked. He hesitated, then answered no. "Then don't." Ethan turned his head, kissed the top of her hair. "Okay." A knock on the door startled them both. It was James. Ethan? His voice called through the wood. Ethan stood, walking over to open it. James looked tired, but not stern. He held 2 beers in his hand, extending one to Ethan.
Hugo ta minute.
Ethan nodded, glancing at Emily before following James out to the porch. The night was thick with summer heat, but a slight breeze stirred the air. James sat down on the top step, motioning for Ethan to sit beside him. They sipped in silence for a moment before James spoke. You know, I wasn't always the man I am now. Ethan said nothing. I came home from the Marines with nothing but a backpack and an attitude. Margaret's parents hated me. Thought I'd ruin her life. Ethan turned to look at him, surprised. James chuckled, a dry, low sound. They had good reason. I was reckless, stubborn, didn't have a clue about real responsibility. Took me years to earn their respect. He took another sip. But I did. Not by showing them how much I made, or how many medals I had. I did it by never giving up on her. By sticking around, even when they made it hard. Ethan stared ahead, listening closely. I see the way you look at Emily, James continued. It reminds me of the way I looked at Margaret.
Full of fire. Full of fear.
Ethan cleared his throat. I love her, sir. More than I've ever loved anything. James nodded. I know. Ethan looked at him.
You don't think I'm good enough.
I think you haven't had the chance to prove yourself. And I think I've been a little too quick to judge. The admission hung in the air.
James sighed.
Brandon, he's easy. You don't have to wonder with him. But you make me think. And thinking's hard for an old man like me. Ethan smiled faintly. I didn't come here to change your mind overnight. No, but you're doing it anyway, James muttered, finishing his beer.
Juste d'un tartare.
I won't. James stood, stretching. Good. Because if you do, I'll find you, even in Atlanta. Ethan laughed softly, and for the first time, it wasn't tense. It was real. They went back inside, the house dim and still. Emily waited in the hallway, her eyes questioning. Ethan nodded, just once. She smiled. That night, as Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he realized something had shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but something had begun to move. A space had opened. A path, narrow but walkable. And for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, he believed it might actually lead somewhere worth going. He closed his eyes. He was staying. Sunday mornings in Millbrook were sacred. Families filled pews at the First Baptist Church, dressed in their finest clothes, their Bibles tucked under arms. After service, it was customary for relatives and neighbors to gather for brunches that doubled as social hours, an unspoken ritual of community, connection, and more subtly judgment. That Sunday, Margaret had invited some extended family over. Just a small gathering, she told Ethan over breakfast. My sister Martha, her husband Joe, and my cousin Diane. Oh, and maybe Mrs. Green will stop by.
She's like family, you know.
Ethan didn't know. But he had a feeling the brunch would be anything but small. By 11, the living room was buzzing. The aroma of honey-glazed ham, biscuits, and fruit salad filled the air. Ethan stood in the kitchen helping Emily lay out the dishes, trying to memorize names and prepare for what felt increasingly like a second round of interviews.
Don't worry, Emily whispered. Just be yourself.
That's what I'm afraid of, Ethan muttered. They carried plates into the dining room where the guests had already begun to gather. Martha was tall and opinionated, with a voice that carried. Her husband Joe was quieter but observant. Diane wore oversized sunglasses indoors and smelled like expensive perfume. And Mrs. Green, well, she didn't miss much. Widow of a former deacon, she held the unofficial title of neighborhood historian. Margaret introduced Ethan with a smile too polished to be sincere.
This is Ethan, Emily's special guest. Ethan extended à Politande.
Nice to meet you all. Martha looked him over. So you're the fellow from Atlanta. Emily says you work in restaurants.
Yes, ma'am. Do you cook?
Joe asked, more curious than critical. Not professionally. I manage operations and logistics, making sure the restaurants run smoothly.
Mrs. Green Reseda.
How many restaurants are we talking? 3 currently, Ethan replied, keeping his tone modest.
Margaret Cutine.
He's been at it for a while, I suppose. Still rents, though. The room went momentarily quiet. Ethan glanced at Emily, whose face had tightened. He answered calmly, yes, I'm renting for now. Buying a home is part of my future plans. Diane sipped her mimosa.
Atlanta is not cheap.
You'd have to do pretty well to afford anything there. I manage, Ethan said with a small smile. Brunch began with polite conversation, mostly centered around the food, the weather, and the upcoming county fair. But soon, as expected, the questions sharpened. So, Martha said between bites of quiche, what brings you to Millbrook? Emily, Ethan replied simply. Mrs. Green chuckled. Of course. But what do you see here besides her? It's not exactly a place full of opportunity for someone with ambition. I didn't come here for opportunity, Ethan said. I came here for honesty. The room quieted again. Margaret cleared her throat. Ethan's just visiting. Emily's staying here for the summer before school starts again. And after that? Joe asked. What happens then?
Ethan glanced at Emily.
She nodded, encouraging him. I'd like Emily to move to Atlanta, Ethan said. Not because it's a big city, but because it's where I'm building my life. But that's a decision we'll make together.
Martha blinked.
And what does that life look like? It looks like hard work, shared goals, and a relationship based on trust, not financial status. Mrs. Green leaned forward. Well, let me ask you this, young man. Do you love her enough to take care of her when things get hard? Because that's when you see someone's true colors.
Ethan Meurgaz.
Yes.
Ido.
Margaret interjected quickly. Let's not turn brunch into a courtroom. But it was too late. The tone had shifted. Emily stood up, her voice firm. Enough. This isn't an interrogation. Sweetheart, Margaret started, but Emily cut her off. You invited them here to meet Ethan, not to dissect him. He's not perfect, but he's real. He doesn't pretend to be someone he's not, and that's more than I can say for most people. The silence that followed was loud. Ethan stood too. I appreciate your concerns. Truly. And I know I might not meet every expectation that's been built over the years. But I love Emily. I came here not to prove that I'm good enough, but to show that I'm willing. Willing to fight for her, to learn, to grow, and to be part of this family if you'll let me. Mrs. Green sat back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. We'll see, she said softly. The rest of brunch passed with minimal conversation. Some small talk returned, but the air was different, thicker. When the last guest finally left, Margaret began clearing the table with short, tense movements. James, who had remained quiet most of the time, turned to Ethan as they stood alone in the hallway. You didn't flinch, he said. I've had practice, Ethan replied. James nodded. Might not be the welcome you hoped for. But you held your own. Ethan looked at him. I didn't come for a welcome.
I came for Emily.
James looked at his daughter, who was finishing up in the kitchen. She's lucky, he said quietly, before walking outside to the porch. Later that evening, as the house settled and the sky turned a deep violet, Ethan and Emily sat together on the back steps. The fireflies were out again, blinking slowly in the warm night air. You didn't have to say all that, she said. But I'm glad you did. They needed to hear it. And so did I. Emily rested her head on his shoulder. I know this isn't easy. Ethan smiled. I didn't come here for easy. She chuckled.
No. You came here for me. And I do it again tomorrow.
In the distance, a train whistle echoed faintly through the hills. Another day in Millbrook had come and gone, and though the road was still long, Ethan felt something settle inside him. Respect wasn't given. It had to be earned. And brick by brick, word by word, he was laying the foundation. The following week passed more quietly. Brandon had not returned since the brunch, though Margaret mentioned once in passing that he had called to check in. Ethan didn't ask more, and Emily didn't offer details. They spent their days walking the edge of the fields, fixing things around the Carter property, and spending evenings on the back porch where the air grew cool and the stars seemed close enough to touch. Ethan knew his time in Millbrook was drawing to a close. Work in Atlanta beckoned, calls and emails piling up, meetings he had deferred now demanding attention. But before leaving, he had one last thing to do. On Thursday morning, he approached James as the older man was working in the shed. "Mr. Carter, I'd like to ask a favor." James looked up from his toolbox. "I'd like to invite you, Mrs. Carter, and Emily to dinner. In Atlanta." James arched a brow. "That right?" "Yes, sir. Nothing fancy. Just a thank you. For your hospitality. And maybe for a fresh start." James eyed him a moment, then gave a single nod. "Let me talk to Margaret. But I think we can manage that." Ethan gave a quiet smile. "Thank you." 2 days later, they drove up to Atlanta together. Ethan insisted they leave the Old Town car at home, and instead he picked them up in his faithful red pickup, cleaned and polished, but still every bit the humble vehicle he'd arrived in. Emily sat beside him in the front seat, her hand on his knee, while James and Margaret rode in the back. The drive took just over an hour. Margaret passed the time commenting on the city skyline as it grew closer, how much Atlanta had changed since her last visit, how tall the buildings were now, how traffic moved like a living thing. James remained mostly quiet, eyes taking in every turn, every street sign. Ethan turned down a wide boulevard lined with trees and modern buildings, then pulled into a discreet parking area beside a contemporary, 3-story structure with soft lighting and dark brick walls.
"D'ici se place?"
Margaret asked, looking out at the restaurant's elegant facade. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said. "Welcome to Alder and Ash." He stepped out, opened the door for Margaret, then Emily. As they entered through the side entrance, a well-dressed host greeted them immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Walker. Your table is ready." James blinked. "Mr. Walker?" Ethan nodded, smiling. "This way." They were led through the dining room, past tables filled with diners dressed in cocktail attire, past open kitchen windows where chefs moved with precision, into a private room at the back, dimly lit, with soft jazz playing overhead, and a table set for 4 with crisp white linens and crystal glasses. "This is one of my restaurants," Ethan said, as he pulled out chairs for them. "The first one, actually."
Margaret froze.
"Wait. One of." "I oversee 3, Ethan said gently. "I'm the managing partner and director of operations. I helped build this one from the ground up." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to hush even the music. James leaned back slowly in his chair. "And you didn't say anything before because—" "I didn't want that to be the reason you accepted me," Ethan said. "If I came here with a suit, a car and a business card, maybe things would have gone smoother. But I needed to know that what Emily and I have, what I'm offering her, was seen for what it is, not what it's worth." Margaret looked around the room, taking in the setting, the polished floor, the quiet reverence of the staff who clearly respected Ethan as more than just a co-worker. "You let us think you were just scraping by," she said slowly. "I didn't lie," Ethan replied. "I told you I rent. That I work in restaurants. It was all true. I just didn't share everything." Emily's hand found his again under the table. "Because he wanted you to see who he is, not what he owns." A server arrived with menus, but James waved them off. "Bring what Mr. Walker recommends," he said, never taking his eyes off Ethan. Dinner unfolded course by course, seasonal small plates, locally sourced meats, dishes crafted with both precision and soul. Conversation returned in trickles, then in full flow. James asked about the process of opening a restaurant. Margaret inquired about the design. Emily added her own stories, how she'd helped Ethan brainstorm names, how they tested menu ideas late into the night. When dessert arrived, a delicate peach tart with bourbon glaze, James set down his fork and looked across the table. "I judged you," he said simply. "Because I thought I had to. Because I didn't understand." Ethan didn't interrupt.
"I saw a man without a house, without a last name I knew, without a plan I could measure."
"And I let that speak louder than how you treated my daughter." He paused, then added, "That was wrong." Margaret nodded slowly beside him.
"I let fear get in the way."
"I thought comfort came from predictability. But I see now that real comfort comes from trust." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. James extended a hand across the table. "If you'll still have us, son, we'd like to be part of your story." Ethan took the offered hand, his grip firm but humble. "Thank you, sir. That means more than I can say." They lingered a while longer after dinner, sipping coffee, laughing at a few stories from Emily's childhood that she'd never dared share before. When they finally rose to leave, the staff lined the entrance, nodding respectfully to their boss. Outside, the air was cool and quiet. James looked up at the restaurant's sign once more. "You built all this," he said, not as a question, but with quiet awe. Ethan nodded. "From scratch." James clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Because I think you're about to build something even better, with Emily." On the drive back to Millbrook, no one said much. But the silence was no longer weighted. It was calm. Settled. A table had been set, not just for a meal, but for truth. And the truth had finally been served. The return to Millbrook after their dinner in Atlanta carried with it a different kind of silence, less tense, more thoughtful. James drove this time, his hands steady on the wheel, while Margaret sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing into the rearview mirror at Emily and Ethan in the back. No one said much, but there was a subtle shift in the way they carried themselves, as though something unspoken had finally been resolved. By the time they pulled into the gravel driveway, the sky had already turned indigo. James parked the car, and without a word, the family stepped out. Emily lingered for a moment with Ethan by the truck before following her parents inside. The night was calm, and the crickets chirped as if to fill in the gaps left by the evening's conversations. The next morning, word had already begun to spread. Millbrook wasn't the kind of town where secrets lasted long. Mrs. Green, somehow, had heard about the dinner at the fancy Atlanta restaurant by sunrise. She passed it on to Martha at the bakery, who shared it with Deacon Harris before service at church. By noon, nearly every neighbor had heard a version of the story, each slightly embellished, but all centering on one core revelation: Ethan Walker wasn't just some quiet city boy. He was a successful businessman. A restaurant owner. A man who had fooled them all. Emily stepped into the corner store that afternoon to buy milk, only to be met with curious glances and half-smiles. "I heard your young man has quite the head on his shoulders," Mrs. Lawrence said from behind the cash register. "I guess there's more to him than meets the eye," added Mr. Thompson, who usually barely grunted a greeting. Emily smiled politely, paid for the milk, and stepped out quickly. On the sidewalk, she found Ethan waiting by the truck, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding whatever emotion stirred behind his eyes. "They're already talking," she said. "I figured they would," he replied. "You okay with that?"
Ethan shrugged.
They were going to talk either way. At least now they're talking about the truth. That afternoon, James invited Ethan to ride into town with him to pick up some lumber. They stopped by the hardware store, and James made no effort to hide his approval when introducing Ethan to a few old friends. "This here's the young man I told you about," James said to Mr. Holloway, the store owner. "Runs a business in the city. Smart. Steady. Not afraid to get his hands dirty either." Ethan shook hands, exchanged a few words, and nodded respectfully. The praise felt strange, unexpected. Not unwelcome, but new. As they loaded the wood into the back of the truck, James glanced over at him. "People around here, they talk," he said. "It's not always kind. But you keep showing up, doing right, they eventually see the real picture." Ethan nodded. "I don't mind being talked about. I just want them to know I'm here for the right reasons." "They're starting to get it," James said. "I can see it." When they returned, Margaret was sitting on the porch with a pitcher of sweet tea, her usual afternoon ritual. This time, she had set out 2 extra glasses. She waved Ethan over with a small smile. "Sit a while," she said.
"You've been running around enough for one day."
Ethan took a seat, accepting the glass. The tea was cold, sweet, with just the right touch of lemon. Margaret watched him for a moment, then cleared her throat. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly. "Not just for how I treated you, but for how I made Emily feel, like she had to justify her choices." Ethan looked at her, surprised but respectful. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot." "I thought I was protecting her," Margaret continued. "But really, I was just protecting my image of what her life should look like. And I see now, it wasn't fair." He didn't rush to respond. Instead, He let the silence sit for a moment, honoring the weight of her words. "I know how much you love her," he said finally. "And I respect that. That's why I never tried to argue. I just hoped you'd see it in time." "I see it now," Margaret said. "And I hope you'll forgive me for taking so long." Ethan smiled. "Of course." That evening they had dinner together again, this time, less formal, more relaxed. James joked about his days in the Marines, Margaret shared an old family recipe for cornbread, and Emily laughed more freely than she had in weeks. Afterward, as the dishes were being washed and the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the trees, Emily pulled Ethan outside for a walk. They strolled through the edge of the field, where the tall grass moved like waves in the wind. "I think they finally see you," she said. "They see us," he corrected. "This only works if they see both of us together." Emily stopped walking. "What now?" Ethan looked out over the land.
I go back to the city tomorrow.
"But I want you to come with me. Permanently." She smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." "You sure?" he asked. "This place, it's home. I know it'll be hard to leave." "I'm not leaving home," she said, taking his hand. "I'm building one, with you." In the distance, the porch light turned on. A signal, perhaps, or just a reminder that family was nearby, always watching, always waiting. As they turned back toward the house, walking side by side through the fading light, Ethan felt something inside him settle. He had come to Millbrook as a stranger, carrying secrets and doubts. Now he was leaving as something else entirely, not just a man in love, but a man accepted. And for the first time, he believed he truly belonged. Sunday morning came with a hush in the air. The early light filtered through the trees as if it knew that something was coming to an end. Birds chirped, the smell of dew clung to the grass, and in the Carter household, the rhythm of a departure had begun. Ethan was up before anyone else. He had already folded his clothes, zipped his bag, and neatly placed his boots by the front door. He stood in the kitchen, sipping a cup of black coffee while staring out the window at the quiet street that had, over the last few weeks, become strangely familiar. Emily joined him not long after, her hair tied in a loose braid, wearing one of his old sweatshirts she had refused to give back. She said nothing at first, just leaned into his side, and together they watched the sunrise crawl across the fields. "You don't have to leave today," she whispered. He kissed the top of her head. "I do. But I'll be back soon." "Soon isn't now." "No," he said gently, "but it's close." She didn't try to argue. She understood the weight of his responsibilities, the work waiting for him in Atlanta, the restaurants that didn't run themselves. But that didn't make saying goodbye easier. By 8, James had loaded Ethan's bag into the back of the truck, and Margaret had wrapped up leftover biscuits in foil for the road. "You'll get hungry an hour in," she said, handing them to him with a motherly firmness Ethan now recognized as affection. "Thank you," he said, accepting them with a smile. Margaret hesitated, then reached forward and hugged him. It was brief, but sincere.
Drive safe, all right?
And don't let those big city folks work you to the bone.
Yes, Mum.
James was leaning against the porch railing, arms crossed. When Ethan approached, he straightened up. "You've got my number now," James said. Ethan nodded. "I'll call. Promise."
You better.
"And listen," he paused, his gaze steady, "you ever need anything at all, you've got a place here." Ethan extended his hand. James didn't shake it. Instead, he pulled Ethan into a quick hug, thumping his back once with the weight of a man who didn't do this sort of thing often. Emily stood by the passenger door, arms folded, trying to be strong. But her eyes were already glassy. "I'll follow you in a few weeks," she said. "Just don't make me wait too long," Ethan replied. He opened the door, threw his bag in, then turned and held her tightly. "You changed everything," he whispered. "No," she said into his chest. "You just showed us who you are." They kissed, slow and meaningful, then parted with one last look that said everything words could not. The truck rumbled to life, pulled out of the gravel driveway, and disappeared down the road, leaving behind only a trail of dust and a girl with a hand over her heart. That night, the Carter house was quieter than usual. James read his paper without commenting, Margaret crocheted without humming. Emily wandered the hallway, stopping in the doorway of the guest room Ethan had stayed in. The bed was made. The mug he had used each morning still sat on the dresser. She picked it up, held it for a long moment, then smiled softly. Back in Atlanta, Ethan arrived at his apartment as the sun dipped low behind the skyline. The city was buzzing, lights blinking, car horns echoing in the distance. He stepped inside, set his bag down, and stood in the middle of the living room. Everything was as he had left it. Yet somehow, it felt different now. Bigger.
Entier.
He walked to the small table by the window and placed Margaret's biscuits there. Then he sat down, pulled out his phone, and texted Emily.
Medit. Feel wait without you.
Can't wait until this place feels like home, with you in it. She responded almost instantly. It already does. Just wait. The following days passed in a blur. Ethan returned to work, jumping back into meetings, visiting kitchens, talking to staff. But he carried with him a renewed sense of clarity. Something had shifted, not just in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. For so long, he had hidden parts of who he was. Not out of shame, but out of strategy. He believed that if he let people see the humble version first, they would judge him more honestly. But now, he realized, that honesty wasn't something he had to coax from others. It was something he had to give freely, completely, without waiting for the right moment. One night, after checking inventory at one of his restaurants, he walked into his office, pulled out a notebook, and wrote 4 words at the top of a new page. Begin again with truth. That weekend, Emily arrived with a small suitcase and a larger dream. They didn't need to discuss the move, it had been understood. She stepped into the apartment, looked around and said, "Okay, what needs fixing first?"
Ethan Loged. Everything.
Together, they rearranged the living room, unpacked boxes, and cooked dinner in the tiny kitchen. They danced barefoot on the hardwood floor, burnt the garlic bread, and fell asleep on the couch watching a documentary neither of them cared about. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And soon, there was another dinner, this time hosted by Ethan and Emily in their apartment. James and Margaret drove up from Millbrook, bringing a pie and enough questions about the city to fill an evening. They sat around a cramped dining table, talking, laughing, and sharing stories. At one point, Margaret looked at Emily and said, "You did good." James raised his glass.
To the unexpected ones.
The ones who prove us wrong, in the best way. They all clinked glasses, and Ethan felt something warm settle in his chest. He wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't testing anyone. He was simply living. Fully. Authentically. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly as it should. 2 weeks after Emily moved in, the apartment began to reflect her presence in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. There were small, quiet signs, her books on the shelf next to his culinary magazines, a mug with her name beside his chipped black one in the cabinet, throw pillows she had insisted on for the couch, and a lavender-scented candle that somehow made the whole space feel warmer. They had slipped into a rhythm without resistance, 2 people used to independence now thriving in each other's orbit. Ethan would rise early to check in with the restaurants before the morning rush, and Emily would prepare for her classes at a nearby school where she had accepted a part-time role. At night, they'd cook, unwind, and talk about everything from business goals to the little details of a shared life they were beginning to imagine. But Ethan had been keeping a secret. Not the kind that undermines trust, but the kind that grows from hope, a quiet plan, forming slowly, like a dish perfected in layers. It had started on the drive back from Millbrook. The moment James Carter had pulled him into that quick, fatherly hug, Ethan knew something had shifted. He had not only earned the respect of Emily's parents, he had earned something deeper, trust. That night, he began searching. Not for a ring, not yet, but for the right way to ask. Not just for her hand, but for everything, her laughter, her faith, her partnership. And then the following Friday afternoon, while Emily was at work and Ethan had the day off, he went shopping. He visited 3 jewelry stores before he found what he was looking for.
Not too flashy, not trendy. Juste simple, classique, élégant.
A round-cut diamond set in a gold band, clean, timeless, quietly confident.
Juste like her.
When the associate placed it in his palm, Ethan stared at it for a long moment. "It's not about the size," he murmured. "It's about the meaning." He paid in full, tucked the ring box into his jacket, and walked out with a heart heavier and lighter all at once. He didn't propose that night.
Or the night after.
Instead, he waited. Waited for the right moment, not perfect but real. That moment came one evening, quiet and ordinary, the kind they'd come to love. They were sitting on the balcony, bare feet propped up on the railing, a half-eaten pizza box between them, and the sky painted with soft streaks of orange and blue. Emily had her head on his shoulder, her fingers tracing idle patterns along his arm. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked.
Millbrook.
She nodded. The quiet.
The stillness.
Knowing every neighbor by name. He thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But I don't miss feeling like I had to prove myself every time I walked into a room." Emily didn't respond immediately. She looked out toward the skyline, eyes reflective. "My mom told me something before we left," she said. "She said she was proud of me, for choosing someone who challenged her ideas of what love should look like." Ethan smiled.
"I'm glad she came around."
"She didn't just come around," Emily said. "She grew. We all did." He turned to her. "You too?" She nodded. "I didn't know what I wanted until I had to fight for it." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was full. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet box. Emily didn't notice right away. She was still watching the last of the sunset fade. "I've been thinking about something," he said. She turned. When her eyes fell on the box in his hand, they widened, but she didn't speak. Ethan opened it slowly, revealing the ring glinting softly in the evening light. "I didn't come to Millbrook looking for love," he began. "I came for you. Because you saw me before anyone else did. You believed in me before I proved anything. You stood by me when I wasn't sure if I was worthy of standing next to you." She swallowed hard, her breath catching. "I want to build a life with you. Not just here, not just now, but always. Through every dinner and every doubt.
Through the slow morning and the long night.
I don't need fireworks. I just need you." He held the box out.
Emily Carter, will you marry me?
She stared at him, eyes wet with emotion, hands pressed over her mouth. Then she nodded. Once. Twice.
Fast, certain.
"Yes," she whispered, and then again louder, her voice breaking. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She threw her arms around him, and for a while, they didn't speak. There was no need. The city hummed below them, and the stars blinked into view above. But all Ethan could feel was her heartbeat against his. Later inside, she stood in front of the mirror, holding her hand up to admire the ring. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "So are you," he replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind. They stood there, just like that, in their small apartment that now held a new layer of meaning. It was still modest, still simple, but now, it was the beginning of forever. The next day, Ethan called James. It was a Saturday morning. James picked up on the third ring. "Hey son," he said casually. "Mr. Carter," Ethan began, then paused. "James.
I'd like your blessing."
There was a long pause on the other end. Ethan could almost hear the gears turning. "You asking for Emily's hand?" "I already did," Ethan said. "She said yes. But I'd still like your blessing. It matters to me." Another pause. "Well," James said finally, voice gruff with feeling, "then you have it." "And her mother?" "She's already planning centerpieces," James replied dryly.
Ethan Loged.
"That sounds about right." They spoke a few more minutes, about logistics, possible dates, whether a church or a garden made more sense. But when Ethan hung up, he felt something even deeper than excitement. He felt peace. The kind that only comes when something long fought for has finally found its place. He turned around, saw Emily curled on the couch with a book in her lap, and walked over to her. She looked up. "Was that my dad?" "He said yes," Ethan replied. She smiled. "Of course he did." He sat beside her, took her hand, and kissed it. And though there was still much to plan, much to prepare, one thing was certain. They were ready. For the future.
For the forever.
For each other. The wedding took place on a cool October afternoon, in a garden just outside of Atlanta, where golden leaves rustled gently with the breeze and the sky above was a perfect, uninterrupted blue. It was not a grand affair with hundreds of guests and ornate chandeliers, but it was everything Ethan and Emily had wanted, simple, heartfelt, and full of meaning. Rows of wooden chairs lined the grassy aisle, decorated with eucalyptus garlands and white flowers. Soft music played from a string quartet in the corner, and candles flickered gently under cream-colored tents. There were no formal dress codes, just a collection of close friends and family, each one handpicked for the role they had played in the journey. James Carter stood at the back with his wife, Margaret, both dressed with quiet dignity. James wore a dark gray suit, his military pins polished and pinned neatly to his lapel. Margaret, in a navy blue dress and a pearl necklace, held a tissue in one hand and a proud smile in the other. Neither of them spoke much in the moments leading up to the ceremony, but the way their eyes followed every detail, the flowers, the guests, the way Emily moved across the lawn, spoke volumes. Ethan waited at the altar, his hands clasped in front of him, his breath steady but charged. He wore a dark tailored suit, his shoes polished, and his tie slightly crooked, just enough to remind everyone that he was still the same man who had driven into Millbrook in a beat-up red truck not too long ago. The music shifted. Emily stepped into view, her arm hooked through James's. Her dress was simple and elegant, ivory satin that caught the afternoon light. Her hair was pulled back in soft waves, a few loose strands framing her face. She walked with a kind of grace that came not from poise, but from knowing exactly where she was going and exactly who was waiting for her. As she and James reached the end of the aisle, Ethan stepped forward. James paused, looked at Ethan, not with the stern scrutiny of their first meeting, but with something deeper. Respect. Gratitude. Maybe even love. He took Ethan's hand, placed Emily's in it, and whispered just loud enough for the groom to hear, "Take care of my girl." "I will," Ethan said. And then Emily was beside him. The ceremony itself was short. A few words from the officiant, a reading from one of Emily's childhood friends, and vows that Ethan and Emily had written themselves. Ethan's voice never wavered as he said, "I promise to choose you, not just today, but every day. I promise to listen, to grow, to never let comfort replace effort. I promise to be the man you believed in, even before I did." Emily's voice cracked slightly when she began.
"I promise to stand by you, not behind.
To walk with you through every season, to protect what we build, and to remind you when you forget, just how worthy you are of love." When they exchanged rings, there was silence, not the awkward kind, but the sacred kind, where every heart seems to hold its breath at once. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant said, and they did, gently, confidently, completely. Applause followed, but it wasn't thunderous. It was warm, sincere, filled with emotion. As the evening unfolded, tables under the tent filled with laughter and clinking glasses. There were toasts. James's was brief but powerful. "Most of you know I didn't make it easy for Ethan," he began, his voice gravelly. "But that's because I wanted to be sure. And now I am. He's not just a good man, he's the right one." Margaret added her own thoughts, less formal but equally moving. "He came into our lives quietly. And now, I can't imagine our family without him." Emily's best friend spoke of their college days, how Emily always believed in real love, even when it was inconvenient or unclear. And Ethan's business partner stood to say, "I've seen him manage chaos, handle pressure, run teams. But the only time I've seen him completely still and certain is when he looks at Emily." The dancing began as the stars rose above. Ethan and Emily swayed slowly to a song they had chosen months ago, one that had played on the radio the night they first said, "I love you." Their steps were quiet, close, unbothered by who watched. When the music changed, guests filled the dance floor.
James Even dansait with Margaret, drawing amused applause from the younger cousin.
Laughter echoed across the lawn, mixing with the distant sound of the city lights flickering on in the horizon. Later, as the crowd thinned and the candles burned lower, Ethan and Emily slipped away to the edge of the garden. They stood barefoot in the grass, away from the music and the photos and the congratulations. "I can't believe it," Emily whispered. "We did it." Ethan pulled her close. "We started it." They stayed like that for a while, just the two of them, surrounded by the night, by the people who mattered, by the story they had rewritten together. In the months that followed, life unfolded not with dramatic twists, but with small, steady milestones. Emily settled into her new school, quickly becoming a favorite among the students. Ethan expanded the restaurant group to include a fourth location, this time with Emily's input on the design and the name. They hosted Sunday dinners at their apartment. Margaret and James visited often, sometimes staying overnight. The conversations that once held tension now brimmed with shared memories and inside jokes. Brandon, surprisingly, sent a short note on their wedding day. It read, "I was wrong. Congratulations.
Nothing more, nothing less."
Ethan didn't reply, but he appreciated the gesture. Every now and then, someone from Millbrook would mention Ethan's story to a friend or neighbor, how he'd shown up in town with nothing but manners and a mystery, and left with the town's respect and a place in one of its oldest families. But to Ethan and Emily, the real story wasn't about what was lost or proven. It was about what was found. A love that didn't arrive in a luxury car. A family that wasn't one with wealth. A future built not on spectacle, but on quiet, consistent, unshakable truth. In their world, there would always be challenges. There would be seasons of growth, of doubt, of change. But there would also be Sunday mornings. Shared coffee. Open hands. And eyes that met across a room with the knowledge that whatever the world demanded, they'd already faced the hardest parts, and chosen each other through it all. And that, in the end, was the only vow that ever really mattered.